And so again, we're going to start by looking at joints and bones here in Maya, and those are going to allow us to create sort of a skeletal system for our characters, and they will, once we skin it to our geometry, will allow us to get deformations in our geometry. So again, joints are used to deform character models and other geometries, and they are a strictly a visual representation in Maya. So they'll show up in our workspace here, but they do not render. And then all they do really is they act as a pivot point for movement. And so there's a couple ways we can get to the joint tools. One way is through the submenu. So if I go here where it says modeling and select rigging from the drop list, and then up at the top now we have all of the rigging menus. And if we go to skeleton, inside skeleton we have a lot of the joint options. So we have here at the top, and actually let me just tear this menu out. We have the Create Joint tool, which is the tool we're going to use primarily to create our joint systems. There are additional tools for the joint tool below, so we can insert new joints to an existing skeletal system. The Mirror Joint tool, which will allow us to take a joint system we've already set up and mirror it over. This will be really handy because we can draw just one arm and one leg, and then we can have it mirror that over so we're doing half the work. Orient Joint tool is just a way to orient the local rotation of the joints themselves, and the Remove Joint tool allows us to remove joints and so forth. So there's a lot of different joint options in here. We'll come back and look at some of these in a little bit. Below that you have the IK handle tool. So in here we can create IK handles, and there's a couple different versions there. So again, we'll come back and look at some of these settings later. So this is one way to get to those tools. Now, a quicker way to have quick access to a lot of those tools is through your shelf. So if you look up here at the top, there should be a tab specifically for rigging. And then let me delete these out. So I created these shortcuts in the last class. By default, your shelf for rigging should look like this, and some of the more commonly used tools will be found here. So you'll notice this icon here. This is our joint tool, and then next to that we have the IK tool. So again, we can access those pretty quickly there. Now, I'm going to start here by looking at the joint tool. So I'm going to click on that icon there, and you'll notice your cursor changes. And with this plus symbol now, if I start just left clicking, I'll left click once and it will start my joint chain. So this is my initial joint. And then as long as I don't hit enter, each subsequent click I make will start adding more joints connected to one another in this chain. Now, if I do want to finalize this, all I want to do is hit enter on my keyboard, and it's going to stop drawing joints. And then if I were to come back to that joint tool and start drawing again, we get a separate joint system. In terms of their visual representation, again, the joints themselves are these kind of little round balls here, and again, they're just a pivot point. So if I grab one and rotate it, it'll move on its pivot point. And then these sort of I guess it's kind of a triangle or a cone shape emanating from the joint itself. That's the bone. Now, if you'll notice here, the bones kind of taper. So here at the base, they'll be thicker, and then they taper off as they connect into the next joint in the hierarchy. So the thicker end here indicates what joint it's actually emanating from. So this thicker end here, bone is actually connected to this joint here. So when you're selecting your joints, you could just simply left click on the joint itself. I usually find that it's quicker and easier just to marquee drag over the bone, because we don't really have to be as precise with our selection this way. Sometimes I find if I just left click on the joint, it doesn't always select that joint. It might actually select the one before it. So I'm in the habit of just selecting the bone itself. Let's see, what else? So you'll notice here, I drew it from the perspective camera, and as I drew these in, it automatically snaps these to the grid plane. So that's why they're flat to the ground there on that grid axis. And this does change depending on what camera we're currently looking through. So if I were to, let's say, go to the right view and grab our joint tool and start drawing joints in here, and I'll hit enter. And if we go to perspective, you'll notice there it snapped in that vertical axis because I was looking from the right direction. Let's go ahead and grab those and delete them. Let's see what else. So, like I mentioned previously, joints are used for rigging, and more specifically, they're used to deform our geometry. Uh, and so, in terms of rigging, I always recommend, even if you have no intentions of becoming a rigger, if you do plan to be a character modeler, I find that it's really helpful or useful to at least rig once in your life, because it will help inform you better in terms of how you should approach modeling, in terms of edge flow and how geometry will deform as it's rigged for animation. And just to show you why, let me create a couple geometries here. And the overall geometry will look pretty identical, or similar at least. So let's pretend like we're making sort of an elbow here. All right, and I'm going to create my joint system. And so let's turn on X-ray mode. And I'm going to start here at the top. Now, usually for any type of appendage that bends, especially for like an elbow or a knee, we generally don't want to draw a straight line with our joint chain. We'll want some type of bend that favors that particular area. So, like in this case, the back of the elbow. So I'm going to come back here and just a little forward here. And so this will be my elbow joint, and then we'll bring this forward here, and it'll create this kind of bend in my hierarchy. And then I'm going to take this joint chain and duplicate it over, so we have an identical joint selection or setup on both systems. And now I'm going to skin these. Now, don't worry too much about skinning yet. We'll get to that here in the coming weeks. But I do need to skin these joints to the geometry just for demonstration here. All right, and so if I want to animate this, what I'll do is, again, we'll pretend like we're animating an elbow. So I'm going to grab that forearm or that joint there and rotate it. And you'll notice I get deformation in the cylinder there, but it's probably not what I would expect or desire in terms of a elbow. It's not bending at all. Now, the reason why we're not getting a bend is because we don't have enough geometry at the joint where we need it. Now, if we grab this other one and rotate it, we get more of a somewhat natural bend. Now, the skin weights are a little off, so I could come in and fix those real quick. And then if I grab that, it should pinch a little better there in that crease. And so I'd have to spend a little more time painting this and finagling it, but that's going to give us a better deformation, especially for, like an elbow. So again, knowing how to rig is really helpful as a character modeler, just because it has you thinking about proper edge flow and how a character might deform as we animate it. So if we don't have enough geometry, we're obviously not going to get the type of deformation that we're after. Let's take these and delete them. Let's start looking at the joint tool options themselves in the tool settings. So I'm going to click on the joint tool again. Now, if you don't have the joint tool options come up, what we can do is the last tool that you selected will actually appear here sort of in the center of your toolbar. So if you look right there, we have the joint tool. If you double click on it, it should open up the tool settings specific to that tool. And I'm going to take this and dock it over here next to my outliner. And I'm going to reset the tool here just to go to default settings. And we're going to go through some of the settings in this list and just take a look at how they affect our joints as we draw them. So at the top here, we have degrees of freedom. And what this does is it dictates the default axes that you can rotate your joints after they've been drawn. So by default, all three, the X, Y, and Z, are turned on. Now, if we start toggling these off, it will limit what axis we can rotate our joints in. So I'm going to leave that on for now, and I will draw in a joint chain and hit enter. And then I'm going to come back here, and we'll do another one. Let's see, let's turn off X and Z, that's fine. And we'll just have Y turned on. And I'm going to draw in a second joint chain and hit enter. Now, I need the channel box up here so we can kind of see the difference. So if I were to grab the initial joint chain at the default settings, I can grab any one of these joints and rotate them in any axis that I want. Now, with the other joint chain where we changed the defaults, we turned off the X and Z. You'll notice when I select a joint and then look at the channel box, the X and Z are currently locked. They have that little gray line there indicating that we can't manipulate these attributes or animate them. And so if I were to come in here and start rotating this, so Y works, but if I were to grab the Z axis or the X axis, these joints will not rotate because they've been locked. Now, this isn't permanent. We can always unlock these at any time. We just need to go here into the channel box, and with those locked attributes, if we right click and go down to unlock selected, it'll remove those limitations. And now if I were to grab this and rotate it in X and Z, I can rotate it in any axis I want. Let's take those and delete them, and let's go back to the tool and reset it. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here, so we're going to go straight down to the orientation settings. And let's start by looking at the Orient Joint to World. And what this does is it dictates the local rotation axis of your joints as we draw them in. And so I'm going to do two joint systems. I'm going to do one with and one without. And so actually I'll start one with the default settings. So here where it says Orient Joint to World, I'm going to leave that off, and we'll draw in a joint chain and hit enter. And then I'm going to come back here and I'm going to turn this on, and then I'll draw in another joint chain. Now initially they look identical, so we really can't see a difference just by looking at them. But if we were to display their local rotation axis, so there's a couple ways you can do this. One way is to select all of your joints, and let me actually we'll select those. If we go up to display, transform, display, in here there's this local rotation axis setting. Now I might use this quite a bit, so I would like to have it up there in my shelf. Now a quick way to add any of these menu functions to your shelf is on your keyboard. If you hold Control and Shift and then left click on the menu item there, it's going to add it to your shelf up here. And so with that in my shelf now, I can come in and turn these on. So you do have to have the joints selected to do this. So this is a slow way of doing it. We'll look at a quicker way to do this in a little bit using component mode. But if we actually look at these joints now, we can see their local rotation axis, which dictates how these objects will rotate. And so if we look here, with our default settings, it's set to not have Orient to World, and what it does is it orients based on the joints themselves. So if you look at the X-axis here, it's actually pointing down the hierarchy or down the chain. So this X-axis for this joint is actually pointing at the next joint here in the hierarchy, and then for this joint, its X-axis is pointing here at the next one, which is this tip joint. The Y's are pointing up positively, and then the Z's are pointing here again in the direction of the angle of that respective joint. Now, if we turn on the Orient Joint to World, what it does is it orients the local rotation axis of those joints based on world space. And so, positive Y is always pointing up, positive X is always pointing right, and positive Z is always pointing forward towards us. And so if we look at those joints now here on the right, they're based on world space instead of the object space or the joints themselves. Typically, we don't want this. So we generally, when we draw our joints, we won't use this setup here on the right. We'll use this here because they'll rotate in a way that's more intuitive, I guess. So let me grab these and delete them. Let's see, what else do we want to look at here? Let me go back to the joint tool. Let's reset this back to default settings. And the next thing we'll look at here are our primary and secondary axis. And so your primary axis dictates what axis will point down the chain or down the hierarchy. So in the previous setup that we had, the X was pointing positively down the hierarchy. And then the secondary axis is what points up in world space. So by default, it's Y. I'm going to set up a couple joint chains here. We'll actually do 3, and we'll do 1 with each setting. So I'm going to use the default here for the first one, and let's just draw this in, and then hit enter. And let's go back to the joint tool. And now for the primary axis, I'm going to switch this one to Y. Now you'll notice as soon as I select the primary axis for Y, it immediately changes the secondary axis. And that's because the secondary axis can never be the same as the primary. And so it automatically switched that over to Z. Let's go ahead and draw this in. And hit enter. And then let's go back and do one more. And I'm going to change this one to Z. And again, you'll notice here the secondary axis automatically flipped to X. Let's draw this in and then hit enter. And again, initially it looks the same, but if I were to grab these joints now, instead of using the local rotation axis to display their local rotation axis, instead I'm going to use component mode just because it's quicker, because I can just select one joint and then apply this to everything. So with all of these joints selected, I'm going to come up here and switch it over to component mode. And then once I'm in component mode, I need to expand this menu here and look for this question mark icon. And I'm going to toggle that question mark icon on. And then it should display the local rotation axis for all of my selected joint hierarchies. Now, if for some reason you turn this on and you still do not see the local rotation axis, what we would want to do is right click on that question mark icon, and here where it says local rotation axis, turn that on, and then we should be able to see those. And so again, if we look at the each joint setup here, so the first one, the primary axis is X. The second one here, the primary axis is Y, and for the last one here, the primary axis is Z. And again, we can tell which is the primary because the axis will point down positively at the joint hierarchy itself. So if we look here, the X is pointing here at the next joint in the hierarchy all the way through, and the same thing here with the Y on the second one here, so that Y is pointing at the next joint and so forth. And then again in this one, it's the Z, and so that Z is pointing down at the next joint in the hierarchy, going down to the tip joint. Now your tip joints will always be oriented at world space, so that's why they're not affected here. So with those, the Y is pointing up, Z is forward, and X is pointing to the right, but we can ignore that. And then in terms of your secondary, again, your secondary axis is always the one pointing up positively in world space. So this first one here, my secondary axis is Y. The second one is Z, and then for the third one, it's X. So again, it just dictates your rotation order. Usually we leave this at default, but if we ever needed to change how it draws these in by default, we can do that through this tool. Let's go back here to object mode. Let's grab these and delete them. Let's go back to the joint tool and hit reset. And let's start looking at some of these other settings. Let's see. We'll come back up here and start looking at some of these checkbox options. And so this first one is scale compensate. And with this one, again, let's maybe draw in a couple joint chains just so we can see the difference. So I'm going to do one here with the default settings first, and I'll hit enter. And then let's go back here and turn that checkbox off and hit enter again. And again, by default, we're really not going to see any difference initially. But if I were to select the initial joint or the joint at the top of the hierarchy here and then bring up my scale tool and then scale each one of these, you'll notice they'll scale differently. So I'm going to uniformly scale each one of these. So the one on the left has that option turned on, and what it does is as I scale it, it compensates, and the rest of the joints in the hierarchy actually maintain their original size. So no matter how large I scale that joint here at the top of the hierarchy, those joints stay the same. And then on the other one, with that option turned off, you'll notice those subsequent joints there in the hierarchy, they will scale at the same rate as our main joint or our parent joint there. So again, this is something we generally will have turned off, or we'll leave on by default. Let's go ahead and delete those. Let's go back into the joint tool and reset it. Auto joint limits. What this does is it will automate limits on the amount of rotation based on how we've drawn our joints in. So let's go ahead and turn this on. Let's see here. Actually, let's do 2 joints, one with out and one with. So let's turn that on. So the one on the left has this turned off, and this allows me to, let's say, select, if this were an arm, my elbow, and rotate it, and it would allow me to break that elbow and continue to rotate it all the way around as much as I want and really break that arm. Now on the other one here, with that option turned on, it will look at our joint setup here, and it will not allow me to rotate this beyond the highest joint here in the hierarchy. So if I were to rotate this in, it's going to reach a point here where it overlaps that initial joint there, and then it locks it in place. I can no longer go beyond that particular point. And then if I go in the opposite direction, it'll do the same thing here until we sort of hit a straight line. And then no matter how hard I try to rotate that, it will not let me break this arm. So it will automatically limit our rotation. Now, this is not a way I would typically do this. There's a way we can do this in the attribute editor that gives us more control. So we'll look at that here in a little bit. Let's delete those and let's look at the next setting here. So I'm going to hit reset. There's a create IK handle tool option in here, which I would recommend never using. It'll create it for you, or it'll automate it, and I think it's better if we just use the specific IK handle tool so we have control over that IK handle. But just so we can see this, if I turn this on and draw in a joint system like this with a little bit of a bend in it and hit enter, it's going to create an IK handle, and we can see how it's attached this handle from the initial joint and the bottom joint here. And if I grab that handle and left click and drag on it, it's going to automate motion in this joint chain. So it's going to be kind of similar to, if you recall from the rigs we used, that motion we were getting in the knees, and then also the IK arms if we were using IK for those. But I think we were hopefully all animating an FK for the arms. But again, typically not something I would use in the joint tool there. Let's go back there and reset that again. The next option we'll look at here is the variable bone radius setting, and so we can see what this does. I'm going to start drawing joints with that default turned on, and so I'm going to left click and put in one joint, and then if I left click and drag out, you'll notice the further away I drag from that joint, the larger the display size is for this joint. And if I keep doing that, each joint I draw in, again, the further away I get, the larger that joint gets. And then if I were to maybe stay a little tighter or closer now, so if I left click and drag in a new joint, and start dragging these in, they're much smaller. And so that'll automatically update based on the distance that we draw these in at. Now, the size of your joints, they don't really matter. Again, it's entirely just a display thing. So, you know, this wouldn't actually affect the deformation of your character or how it animates or moves. The only thing that's really important is where the center of that pivot point is at, or the center of the joint. The only other thing this might affect is if, let's say, the radius is too big, it might just obscure your view of your geometry, and it might make it hard to see what's happening in terms of your character's performance. But in terms of the actual deformation, not going to affect anything. We can change the radius at any time, though. So if we were to go up here to display, and go down to animation, and in here there's an option for joint size. If we click that, it'll open up a dialog box, and this will affect the joint size universally in your entire scene. So if I drag this up or down, it's going to change the display size of all of our joints. So I'm going to set that back to 1, and then we'll close that out. Now let's go back to that joint tool and let's turn that setting off. So variable bone radius, let's turn that off. And now you'll notice as I drag these in, it's just going to bring these all in at the default size of radius of 1. No matter how far apart or close I draw these together, they'll just all be the same size. Let's delete that and delete that. Let's come in here and reset that tool. And I think that's really it for the joint tool, at least in the tool settings here. Now let's look at the attributes for the joint in the attribute editor over there on the right hand side. So I am going to need some type of joint system just so we can see this. So I'm going to go to, let's say, the right view, and I'm going to drag in a series of 3 joints here as if we have a leg, and I'm going to hit enter. And then I'm going to select just one of these joints and then come over here to the attribute editor and take a look. And so we'll start here at the top and work our way through here to the joint system. So the first thing we have here is the transform attributes, and really these are just the same settings we get out of the channel box. So the translate, rotate, and scale, all that's the same. So whatever we do here will also reflect in the channel box. So we probably won't really mess with any of this a whole lot, but you know, we could come in and rotate things if we wanted to, or scale and so forth. So probably not something we would ever affect here. Now if we keep going here, we have the joint menu. In here you have things like draw style, radius, degrees of freedom, stiffness, and so forth. So here for draw style, just dictates the display style of the bones themselves. So, you know, we could come in and turn it to none and the bone won't display at all. Not something I would typically do. So again, we could leave that alone. The radius, this is a way you can control the display size of a particular bone. So whatever you have selected here, if we come in and change this, you know, I could key in a 5 and it's going to change the radius of that joint. We could key in maybe a 0.5 and make it really small. And so again, whatever we have in here is going to dictate the display size. So we can always come in at any time and adjust that. We also have the degrees of freedom. So this is the same settings we were getting out of the tool itself. So let me grab this sort of elbow joint here. And again, I can come in and deselect any one of these. So let's turn off the X and Y. And if you look in the channel box, again, it's just locking these. And so if I were to come in now and rotate this, I can rotate it in Z, but I can't, no matter what I do, rotate it in X. Now I could come into the channel box and unlock these, or if I go into the attribute editor and just turn on these checkboxes here, it's going to do the same thing. But now I've re-enabled my ability to rotate this in whatever direction I want. Stiffness. So stiffness is a setting for the human IK system, and this will dictate how stiff the joints are. We really won't use this much. That would only be if we're using the human IK system. So we'll skip that. Preferred angle. So this comes in handy when creating IK systems. Preferred angle is used to reset the angle at which the vector is being calculated from. We'll probably leave this at default and won't change it when we do our setup though. And then joint orientation just dictates the local rotation axis of our joints. If we wanted to come in and fix those or change them by hand. Next, we have joint labeling, and this will allow us to label our joints. Now, again, this is probably an option I don't typically use, but if you did want to have some type of display where your joints are labeled, we could do that. Now, in order to see this, we need to turn the draw label on first. So I'm going to click this checkbox. And now if you notice, if we look at the joint there or zoom in, yeah, let me change my background so it's a little easier to see. Right now I haven't told it what type of label to have yet, so currently it reads none. But above here you have side and type. So side is a way to identify or a label based on, you know, what side of your geometry or your character this is. So let's say we were rigging a character with 2 arms. We could come in and where it says side, left click, and in here you have left, right, and none, and center. So let's say you had a left arm and a right arm. We could come in and specify if this is left or right arm or left or right leg or so forth. Now I'm going to switch this back to none. Type will allow us to change the type of label. So let's say we're doing a character and this was a foot or an elbow or a knee. We could click that in, and then if you look at the label itself, it will be labeled as such. Now if you needed something more custom, we could click this and go down to other. So towards the middle there, we'll click other. And now the other type is available, and I can come in and name this whatever I want. So I could call it, let's say, neck joint 01, and type that in, and now for the display there, it's going to have that in place for that particular joint. And so we could go into all of our joints and label them this way, and we'll just have these joint labels always displayed there on top of that respective joint. Again, not something I use. Usually ends up being kind of messy visually, so not something I'll use. The next thing we have is limit information. So if I expand this, in here we have the ability to limit things like our translate and rotation. Now, I'm not going to limit the translation. In most cases, we're probably not going to translate our joints anyhow. So I'm going to collapse that, and we will look at rotation. So you'll notice we have, on the left-hand side, we have limit X, Y, Z, and then they're labeled here for minimum, current, and maximum. And on either side, we have these check boxes. And so here on the left, this is the minimum value that we could ever rotate or animate this particular joint in. And on the right, it's the maximum value we could ever rotate this in any given axis. And so this is really handy as a rigger. If we want to prevent our animator from breaking our rig, we can limit their ability by adjusting these settings here in this in the attribute editor. So let's say this is an elbow, and let me go to the channel box here. Let's say we want to limit our animator's ability to break this elbow. Well, what I would need to do first is find that range, that I want to limit this elbow movement in. And so I know our elbow should only move in Z, and so I want to find, what degree I want to limit the rotation. So maybe somewhere right around here. I would only want this to rotate in positively somewhere around 100 pixels or 100 units. So there, it looks like rotate Z, we're at about 100. And then I'm going to rotate this back. And let's say I want to prevent my animator from breaking this elbow. I'm going to rotate it until it's mostly straight and then see what value I have here. And so the minimum is negative, we'll call it negative 65. So now we know our range is negative 65 to positive 100. I'm going to set this back to default, so I'm going to key in a 0. Let's go to the attribute editor, and I'm going to turn on for rotate Z limit. I'm going to turn on the minimum here and the maximum here. And then I think my minimum, I said negative 65. And then for my maximum positive 100. And so now we can go between that range only, and I can't go below or above these values. And so if I were to grab that joint and rotate it, and I'm going to bring up the channel box just so you can see it. If I were to left click and drag on this, once I hit 100, it caps out, and I can no longer move this beyond 100. And then if I go in the opposite direction, I can no longer go beyond negative 65. And in this way, we can prevent our animators from really breaking our rig or breaking this arm. Let's see. What else? That's really it for our attributes here. There is a scale, and again, it's the same concept as the rotate, but it's scale instead of rotation. Let me go ahead and grab this and delete it. And the last thing we'll look at here is the importance of local rotation axis. So I'm going to draw in a joint chain, and we're going to do this from the right view. And I'm going to draw this in sort of as a spiraling tail, like so. And I'll hit enter. And let's take a look at this in perspective. Now, I need to select this tail in order to unfold it or animate it outwards. So to select a joint hierarchy, there's a couple ways you can do it. Now, if I select the joint at the top of the hierarchy, or the parent joint, so it's going to be the first joint I drew in, so it's going to be this one here. If I select it, it looks like the entire hierarchy is selected. So right now, all the joints are green. So that's a little deceiving. When I clicked on that joint, it actually only selected the parent, and if I rotate it, all of the children have to follow it. So we're not actually animating or rotating the joints there as they move through the hierarchy. So not really what we want. We want to select all the individual joints. So a couple ways to do this. One way, and this is the slow way to do it, is we could start at the bottom of the hierarchy. So I'm going to start here, and one joint at a time, I will shift select every child joint until I get to the top of the hierarchy. And so like I said, I prefer to select the bone, not the joint, because it's a little quicker and easier. And then once we do that, if we were to rotate this out, it's going to curl in a way that's really not expected. So we're getting this really weird curling effect where it's kind of corkscrewing and just really deforming in a strange way, which isn't really what we would want if we wanted to, say, have a tail unfold or unfurrow out. So let me undo that. Now, another way to select these before we get ahead of ourselves, so if I wanted to select all of the joints in a hierarchy, I can also do it through the outliner. So if I go to the outliner there, we can see that initial joint in my hierarchy. And if I click that plus symbol, it'll go to the next joint in the hierarchy. And if we keep clicking these, we get further down into the sublayers. And if we wanted, again, we could come in through here and expand all these. Also, this is the slow way to expand these. And then we could start at the bottom of the hierarchy, and then I'll select that one and then hold Control, and then Control select each joint as I work my way up through this hierarchy. So another way to do this, kind of slowly, and then we can rotate that out, and all joints will move together. Another way we could do this is, let me actually collapse this. And so a really quick way to expand an entire hierarchy, instead of just clicking the plus button one at a time, if you hold Shift and click that plus button, it'll expand the entire hierarchy all at once. And if I hold Shift and click on that again, it'll collapse the entire hierarchy. So it's just a quicker way to do that. So another way to do this that's a lot faster is to use the selection method up here, select hierarchy. Now, I might use this a lot, so I'm going to add it to my shelf. So I'm going to hold the Control and Shift key, and I'm going to go ahead and left click and add that right there to my shelf. And then I'm going to select the first joint at the top of the hierarchy. And then with that joint selected, I'll come up here and click on hierarchy. And it's going to select every joint in that entire hierarchy. So a couple ways to select all of our joints. But again, if I rotate these out, I get this kind of weird corkscrew effect, and they're not going to rotate out the way I would like them to. So let me undo that. And what we need to do is we need to correct their local rotation axis. And again, that's the axis at which these joints are rotating from, or their rotation order. Now, I want to make their local rotation axis visible. And so a really quick way to do this, again, is through the component mode. So I'm going to select the first joint in the hierarchy. I'm going to come up here to the component mode. So it's this, looks like a box divided in 4 quadrants. If I click on that, and then come down here and turn on that question mark, I should be able to see all the local rotation axes for all these joints. Now, the reason why they're behaving unexpected is because the z-axis, the axis that I want to rotate these out on, they're not all facing the same direction. Some face the left, some face the right. And so in order to fix this, I would need to have them all face in the same direction. Now, I would like some precision to this, so I wouldn't want to just come in and grab one of these and rotate it by hand, because there's really not a whole lot of precision to this. So it would be nice if I had maybe a shortcut or a shelf button up there that would allow me to automate this more precisely. So we're going to use a Mel script to do this, and we're going to cheat a little bit. So, you know, if we're not entirely familiar with scripting, we really don't need to. We can have the script editor help us with that. So if I come over here in the bottom right hand corner and click on this icon, it's going to open up the script editor, and actually has my script in there already. Let me delete that out. If you look at the top of the script editor, it actually saves every function you do in Maya as you do it. So if you make a selection, move something, rotate it, move a vertice or whatever, it's going to populate the information here in the script editor for that function. And so what I could do is, let's grab one of these joints, or the local rotation axis for this joint, and then I'm going to rotate it slightly here. It looks like I need to rotate it in X. So as I rotate it in X, you can see we can control where the Z points. And so I'm going to make some type of rotation. It doesn't really matter what degree I make it. And then once I rotate it, you'll notice here we get this option here at the top of the script editor, and it's saying the function that I performed. So it's saying I'm doing a rotate, so rotate or -R, -OS, -FO, and then it's going to have the degree at which I rotated in what particular axis. So I should have three values here. So I have a value of -45, 0, and 0. And so this -45 is my x-axis, and so I rotated it on its x-axis by 45 degrees negative, approximate, and then I didn't rotate the other two. So what I can do now is I can take this and middle mouse click and drag it down below into my Mel script area, and then all I need to do is correct the value there. And so instead of -45, let's grab that value and key in 90. And then if I want to create a shortcut for this, I'm going to select that entire script and then middle mouse click and drag it up here in my shelf, and then let go of middle mouse click. It'll make a shelf button up there, and then I can label this if I want to. So I'm going to right click on that and hit edit, and then I'm going to go to shelves tab, and then down below where it says icon label, I'm going to do R90 for rotate 90, and then save that shelf tab. We're done in the script editor, so I can close that out. And then I did rotate this in X just so I could write the script. I don't actually want that 45-degree rotation, so I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that rotation that I did. And now what we need to do is we just need to make it consistent in terms of these Z's. We need them all to face in the same direction. So I'd maybe like them all to face to the right here. And so I'm going to look for any of these that are facing to the left. I'm going to select that local rotation axis. I'm going to tap on that R90 until the Z is pointing right. And so I'm going to go through, excuse me, I'm starting to lose my voice. I'm going to go through and rotate these 90 degrees until, again, they're all consistent. And so this is going to become really important when we have our spine and our knees. If we don't do this, our spine and knees might rotate in a strange order. Or it looks like they might break or deform strangely. And let's see, am I missing anything? Oh. The one thing we don't have to worry about is the tip joint. So again, like I previously mentioned, the tip joint will always face based on world orientation. It's not going to affect anything, so it can stay the way it is. But all of my Z's are corrected. They're all facing in the same direction now. So let's go back to object mode. I'm going to select the tip joint, or not the tip joint, the joint here at the top of the hierarchy. So it's our original joint there. And then I'm going to go up here to select all in the hierarchy. And then if we rotate this out, it should unfurl like a tail or unravel like we would expect it to there in the x-axis. So instead of doing that weird kind of corkscrew, it's behaving a little more accurate to how I would want it to. Let's see. What else? Let's look at a couple ways we can continue to draw joints on an existing system. So I'm going to go to my right view again. And so let's say we have a joint system and I want to add more joints to it. What we can do is go select the joint tool. And let's say I want to start building more joints based off of this joint here. Well, with the joint tool, if I left click on that joint once, it will initialize the joint drawing system again. And then if I start clicking outside of that joint, it will start attaching a new joint system to that joint. And then if I hit enter, we'll have a new sort of branch of joints there. And then we could do this again. It really doesn't matter where we do this at. So I can grab that joint tool and I can click on this joint now to initialize it and then continue drawing from there. Now another way we could continue drawing joints here, maybe as part of the same joint chain, is on your keyboard. If you have a joint already selected, if I hit up on my keyboard, it's going to go up in the hierarchy. And just so we can see that, let me expand this hierarchy here in the outliner. And then if I hit down, on my arrow keys, you can see it's going to go down the chain. So this is called pick walking. And so if I hit down, it'll go down through the hierarchy, and then again up, it'll go back in the hierarchy. But if I were to, let's say, go back to a joint here and then continue drawing, it's going to branch off from whatever joint I had selected. And then if I hit down on my arrow key, or actually let's go up and then highlight that joint, and then we could continue drawing from there. And so we get this kind of branching effect. And then if I want to finalize this, I'll just hit enter on my keyboard, and then we just have this kind of long spiraling or branching joint chain. Let's see what else. In terms of joints, the way we're drawing them here, all it is a parent-child relationship. That's all this is. So if we ever wanted to maybe reconfigure how joints are set up, we can select any of these at any time. And so I'll grab, let's say, this tip joint, and to unparent something, the keyboard shortcut is Shift P. So if I hold Shift and hit P, it's going to unparent that. And so I can go through and select these joints and unparent them. Oh, oopsie doodle. And then after we've unparented those, you'll notice they'll all be here as individual joints at the bottom of our outliner. And then if I wanted to, I could move these and position them around. And then we could start parenting these together. So again, in terms of parenting, you always select the child first, the parent last. And so if I wanted, let's say, this joint here to be the child of this parent, what I could do is select that joint first, grab this one second, and hit P to parent those. And I could go all the way around here, and just using parent-child relationships, reconnect these together to make a joint chain. Now you typically wouldn't do it this way, but you could if you wanted to. We wouldn't want to do this because it does mess up the local rotation axis, or it's harder to dictate how those will behave if we do it this way. If we go up to the joint tool here in the skeleton menu, so let me tear this out. There are a couple tools in here that might be useful. So one tool here we have is the insert joint tool. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to activate that tool. And then to actually insert the joint, what we need to do is left click on one of the existing joints and then drag it in. And so if I click on that again, we could continue to draw these in, and it's going to insert it into that hierarchy. So this is really handy, especially when we do the forearm, because we'll block out the major arm first, and then we'll add probably two more there in the forearm to get sort of that natural twist that happens with those bones in your forearm. I'm going to delete all these real quick. I'm going to go to the top view, and I'm going to draw in, I guess, what would be essentially a arm. All right, so let's say this is an arm with a hand on it. So we could use the mirror joint tool to mirror this over so that we don't have to redraw the same arm again. So if I grab the joint here for the upper arm and then go over here to the mirror joint tool and click on the options box, I'm going to reset the settings here. And what we need it to do is flip it from this side to the opposite side. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to flip it from Y to Z. And so I need to make sure that I have that option selected. If I don't, so I'm going to leave it at X and Y. It will flip it, but just not in the right axis. So let me take that and delete it. And let's go in here and select Y to Z, hit apply, and it should mirror it on over to the other side. So this is going to make our lives a lot easier when we do the arms and legs. That way we're only doing half the work. That's the mirror joint tool. Orient joint tool we'll mess with a little bit later in the semester. Let's see, is there anything else in here? Remove joint tool might be handy. Let me draw in a series of joints here real quick. And so the remove joint tool will allow you to do just that. So if I grab that tool, well, actually it looks like I might need to select a joint first, and then hit remove. It's going to remove whatever joint you have selected. So that's the joint tool. I'm going to stop here and give you guys about 10 minutes or so to play around with the joint tool. So I would like you to just get comfortable with drawing joints in, maybe playing around with the local rotation axis, and just playing with joint hierarchies in general. So I'll stop here.